A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid manyfold, and the end is not yet.
Joseph Stalin was furious. The Americans had something he didn't have: the atom bomb. This fury, this fiery rage, marked a turning point not just for Russia and the Soviet Union, but for all mankind, as it grew what became Russia's true quest for the bomb. This quest, led internally by the likes of Igor Kurchatov and Yakov Zeldovich, and further spurred by the head of the NKVD Lavrentiy Beria, would sow the seeds for a program that would grow the world's largest nuclear stockpile. A stockpile that, to this very day, has held mankind hostage. This is the story of how Russia got its nuclear weapons. Igor Kurchatov was relatively new to nuclear physics. A student of ferroelectricity, Kurchatov would refocus to the growing field of nuclear physics in 1933. His study would rapidly increase as the 1938 discovery of fission spread throughout the physics community. Kurchatov, along with other Soviet scientists, would take this discovery and validate it for themselves, and would later present to the Presidium of the Soviet Academy of Sciences what they had discovered. Their discoveries would lead the Presidium to create a plan to further develop the Soviet Union's understanding of nuclear physics. These plans, however, would be short-lived, as the surprise war with Germany began to consume the Soviet Union. Kurchatov, as well as his fellow physicists, were pressed into service, but not in pursuit of the bomb. They were pressed into service on other research projects directly related to the war effort. Kurchatov would help research how to protect Soviet ships from magnetic mines, and would later assist with armor research. It wasn't until fellow Soviet physicist Grigory Flerov noticed something strange. Western articles on nuclear physics stopped coming in. It wasn't that the Soviet Union had stopped receiving them, it's that they'd stopped being sent. The US had only recently entered into the war at this time, and this cutting-edge research had direct military value, as Flerov and Kurchatov uncovered. Flerov believed that this meant that the US must have decided to make secret any further research on atomic steady. Why this was, Flerov could only imagine. Flerov would write letters to Joseph Stalin and Igor Kurchatov recommending that the nuclear program be resumed immediately, and that the US must be developing a bomb for themselves. It wasn't until after the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943 that the Soviet nuclear program would ramp up. Laboratory number 2 would be created in Moscow, led by Igor Kurchatov. This would later become the Russian Research Center Kurchatov Institute, known today. This program would begin theoretical work on nuclear physics, from the development of a uranium pile, which they tested to create a chain reaction, to the study on uranium-235 and its fissile properties. Laboratory number 2 would also receive a helping hand from an unlikely source, one that would prove instrumental in the Soviet Union's race for the bomb. Joseph Stalin, aware that the Soviet Union needed a bomb, had granted Kurchatov all he needed to get the project going. Still, Stalin had more levers to pull, and can draw on a network that spanned the globe. Nested inside the Manhattan Project were a number of scientists who were not loyal to the United States. They were loyal to communism, and were willing to pass the secrets that they were working on onto Soviet spies within the US. Among these scientists were Klaus Fuchs, as well as a couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. These three were among the most popular in what was a wide network of Soviet assets inside the Manhattan Project. These assets fed the information they gathered while at work back to their Soviet handlers, which made it all the way to Moscow and ultimately to Stalin. Still, Stalin wouldn't trust his intelligence until the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, and then only Kurchatov would be granted access to this information. Kurchatov would have to remain quiet about what he had seen, and if he needed to rely on the physics lessons gleaned from the intelligence reports, he would have to disguise it as some sort of profound insight. Still, even with the intelligence sharing, the project continued to move slowly, with scarce resources allocated to atomic steady. In 1945, Stalin would visit Western leaders at the Potsdam Conference. US President Truman, who had only recently received received confirmation that the Trinity tests in Los Alamos was successful, would tell Stalin that the US had, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, who had maintained awareness of the Manhattan Project, no doubt knew what this was in reference to. He wouldn't have much time to process this, however, as shortly after the conference, the US would drop the first bomb in Hiroshima and the second in Nagasaki. Stalin was furious. He'd been beaten to the bomb, and now the US had a weapon that he didn't. Nobody else had the weapon that the United States had. The only way for Stalin to make the Soviet Union a superpower was to get the bomb, and he turned to the only person he knew could deliver the results that he needed. That man was not Igor Kurchatov. It was Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB. Beria was feared and known for his terror tactics that got the results that he needed. He could deliver Stalin the bomb by any means necessary. As World War II ended, the Soviet Union entered into a new phase of conflict. This conflict wasn't fought with weapons of World War II, though. This conflict was a Cold War with the United States. And in this Cold War, the United States had atomic weapons, and the Soviet Union did not. Truman knew this, and confident in his leverage, would use it to keep the Soviet Union at bay. Beria and Kurchatov got to work, with Beria directing the use of prisoners from across the Soviet Union's many gulags to assist in mining uranium and the construction of new facilities. Kurchatov, as well as his fellow scientists, would increase the pace of study, working to get the first nuclear chain reaction going. That first reaction would occur in 1946 and would mark an important step in the Soviet nuclear program. Now that nuclear fission had been proven to work, they needed to scale up and use the intelligence collected from Fuchs and the other spies in America to create a bomb. This intelligence would help in other ways as well. The work of Arthur Compton in Chicago to produce plutonium would generate intelligence from Soviet assets within the Chicago facility, and that would help Kurchatov to develop a plutonium processing plant in 1948 called Chelyabinsk 65, later known as Ozersk. By 1948, the Cold War began to take shape. Stalin, angry with the US, Britain, and France for conspiring to create a new German state in West Germany without first consulting him, would order the Red Army to prevent Western convoys from traveling between West Germany to Berlin. Still, the US owned the nuclear monopoly, and when it began flying aircraft in what became the Berlin airlift, Stalin was left with no other option but to sit back and watch. He may have had the largest conventional army, but they had the nukes, and he did not. In 1949, the first batch of plutonium was created, and the product was moved to a facility called the Installation, which sat near a secret city called Sarov. This facility, Arzamas 16, which today is the All-Russian Scientific Research Institute of Experimental Physics, birthed Russia's nuclear program and remains today a closed city. After the plutonium product arrived, as well as the sufficient level of uranium-235, it was fashioned into a direct copy of Fat Man, the US bomb dropped on Nagasaki. By this point, the Berlin airlift had ended, and Western powers had once again embarrassed Stalin. On August 29, 1949, Stalin would be embarrassed no more. What the US would later call Joe 1 and the Soviets would call First Lightning, the Soviet Union's first nuclear bomb, was tested in the Kazakh SSR. On September 3rd, an American plane specially equipped to detect nuclear blasts caught radioactive particles in a flight between Japan and Alaska. This confirmed the worst and surprised many in the United States. The Soviets were now a nuclear power. That it wasn't just that the Soviets now had the bomb, it's that the monster that Oppenheimer and Fermi were beginning to recognize wasn't just their own monster anymore. It was too late to backtrack on the monster they had built in Los Alamos. Kurchatov had built one of his own, and little did they know, Kurchatov's own monster was built thanks to the theft of information on Oppenheimer's own bomb. There could be no return back. This monster was truly loosed on the world, and it wasn't just anyone who had gotten hold of the bomb for themselves. It was Joseph Stalin, who viewed it as a weapon to wield and not a terror to be restrained. Stalin, now on equal footing with Truman, would begin a race between the Soviet Union and the United States that would continue long past their deaths. The atom bomb would give way to the hydrogen bomb, and Stalin's empire would later detonate the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear device ever tested. The monster created by Oppenheimer and Fermi and later copied by Kurchatov had morphed into something so terrible that there was no denying the purpose of its use. This wasn't a weapon to win wars, it was a terror to end humanity, and the two countries that guided mankind into the nuclear age would aid it in its evolution. Kurchatov and Zeldovich, like their Manhattan Project counterparts, would regret their involvement in the projects. Regardless, also like their counterparts, the project was no longer theirs. They could no longer hide hide nuclear annihilation behind theoretical physics. It had finally been implemented. There was no going back. Klaus Fuchs, as well as his fellow spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, would ultimately be arrested in 1950. Fuchs would serve a 14-year prison term before being freed on good behavior. He would later settle in East Germany. The Rosenbergs, however, weren't so lucky. Loyal communists, but still American, the two would be sentenced to death. Now that the Soviet Union itself had the bomb, more countries would want it for themselves, not only to stake a claim at national greatness, but to ensure national survival. As their own security interests came under threat from the United States or Soviet Union, these countries would seek assurance for survival while concurrently spreading the reach of nuclear Frankenstein. The US had its nuclear monopoly for 4 years. The Soviet Union would share with the US in a nuclear duopoly for only 3, as another nation would gain its first weapons. As the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and gave way to modern Russia, the fear of the nuclear monster shifted from a first strike to an accidental leakage. The Soviet Union's nuclear stockpile had been spread to countries that were no longer Soviet, and the threat of groups gaining access to these weapons and the turmoil grew. Russia would ultimately regain full control of its nuclear weapons, with agreements such as the Budapest Memorandum with Ukraine passing Soviet weapons back to Russia in exchange for promises that Russia would not threaten its national sovereignty. In 2022, these same weapons would be used to keep the West back as Russia began its bloody invasion of Ukraine. Stalin wanted to make the Soviet Union great, and he sought an equal, if not superior, posture to Harry Truman. While he got his wish, he also increased the stakes of the Cold War from controlling world order to humanity's extinction. This threat wouldn't end with the Soviet Union. It continues to this day.